Thank you, choir. Let me tell you about a gentleman named Gilbert Baker. In 1952, Gilbert was born in the small town of Chanute, Kansas. Anyone know where that is? There's one in every crowd. So Gilbert's dad was a judge and his mom was a teacher. And when he was 18, he was drafted into the Army and he became a medic and he was stationed in San Francisco. He was honorably discharged in 1972 and he decided to stay in San Francisco. At the time, it was one of the few places in the world where gay people like Gilbert could live openly and find community and belonging. And Gilbert became an activist and he also learned how to sew. He created banners for marches for gay rights and other causes and for political campaigns. And that is how he met and became friends with Harvey Milk, who, as we know, was the first openly gay person in California to be elected to public office. In 1978, Gilbert worked with some volunteer friends of his to create homemade dyes, and they used colors that were bleached from their very own clothes. For one project, they dyed fabric, cut the different pieces into strips, stitched them together, and created one of the most universally recognized symbols in the world, the rainbow flag. Gilbert refused to trademark his design. He said this about the flag, very important. He said, "What I liked about the rainbow is that it fits all of us. It's all the colors. It represents all the genders. It represents all the races. It is the rainbow of humanity." And I absolutely love what Gilbert said about the rainbow flag representing all of humanity. It affirms that we're all unique, but that we're also of one piece, stitched together. And I need to remind myself of that these days. We have so many angry voices in our culture, people who are fearful of others, who believe it's natural for one color of people, one type of people, the followers of one religion or one political philosophy to dominate and to exclude others. They can even believe that their cause is a holy one, informed by a small kind of faith that says God categorizes people as either insiders or as outsiders, as accepted or as rejected. You know, I choose to believe in the God whose covenant relationship is with all of us, the God of the rainbow. Now, the rainbow flag itself is obviously a symbol of gay pride. But I have come to learn that in practice, it can mean much, much more than that. Like Gilbert Baker said, it represents all of us. Now, a lot of churches, including Foothills, have gone through a process of becoming what we call an open and affirming congregation. And I think it's good to review every so often exactly what that means. In most churches, and I believe Foothills did this too several years ago, in the open and affirming process, you study and you discuss things like what the Bible really has to say about homosexuality, because there are plenty of misunderstandings about that that are very common out there. You might watch and you might discuss some documentaries on the topic, and you spend time listening to each other and thinking through what your attitudes and beliefs have been and how that's all evolved. And then you flesh out the difference between, on the one hand, merely agreeing that gay people are going to be welcome in your church, and on the other hand, being more open and overt about that, to be intentionally welcoming. Now, I do not know if this happened here at Foothills, but it's not uncommon during this process for there to be some confusion over what open and affirming really signifies. Now, some members can come honestly to the mistaken conclusion that it means, well, this means we're becoming a gay church. Of course, it's not about that at all. In my experience, any open and affirming church has about the same percentage of gay members as the general population does. The difference is this: in an open and affirming church, those gay members can be themselves transparently and authentically. And just like anyone else, they can be affirmed for who they are, just as God created them to be. They are welcomed, accepted, loved, and expected to pitch in and do their part, just like everybody else. In fact, they're not considered they at all, but us. Just another one of us who are doing the work of loving and serving God by loving our neighbors as ourselves. That's why making other people aware, people outside the church aware that you're an open and affirming church is a whole lot more important than you might first think. Because historically, and even today, Christian churches as a whole have not exactly been very welcoming to gay people. More often than not, if you were gay and you went to church, that was something you had to keep under wraps. So many times the church has been downright hostile, pulling one of the very rare references to homosexuality that's found in the Bible completely out of context, or conveniently ignoring its original meaning and intent to justify wounding and shaming and condemning gay people. In a larger sense, those churches are practicing the belief that God is in the business of categorizing people as either insiders or outsiders, as either welcome or rejected. Plenty of gay folks have been seriously traumatized and made to feel like damaged goods by the church, or they've been told that God hates them, all in the name of a faith that's supposed to be about loving each other. Personally, I cannot think of a worse kind of blasphemy. Little wonder that a ton of people, gay and straight, just don't want to have anything to do at all with a faith that practices that kind of exclusion and hypocrisy. And it's one of the key reasons so many people today do not attend church at all, especially straight couples who are raising their kids to accept and love and respect all people, regardless of how they're made. Who wants to raise their kids in an atmosphere where they're teaching intolerance and hate? But sadly, that has been the case for so long in churches that many folks out there just assume that if you call yourself a Christian, well, you must be homophobic, which of course would be news to millions of gay Christians. And it would be news to even more straight people who are attracted to a particular church precisely because all people are welcome there. I have lost count of the number of young families who have visited and joined churches I have served simply because the church was flying a rainbow flag outside. It is what drew them in the first place. They walked in happily surprised that a church of all places would ever be that welcoming and accepting. For those couples with kids, they never thought for a minute the rainbow flag meant that this was a gay church. They knew that it meant what it meant, that it was a church that was open to everyone. Not accepting gay people would also be news to Jesus, who had every opportunity in the world to be quoted about his thoughts on homosexuality, but he apparently didn't think it was even worth his time to mention. Instead, he mentioned many times that any religious doctrine that is out of sync with the principle of unconditional love is a bunch of baloney. So by being open and affirming, and especially if we ever use a rainbow flag to symbolize that, we are doing much more than just putting out a welcome mat for LGBTQ people. We are doing that for sure. But in a much larger sense, we're saying to everyone, whether you're straight or gay, that we do not presume to place any limits at all on the welcoming love of God that knows no limits. We are affirming a way of understanding our place in the world and our relationship with all people everywhere. We're saying we are in a loving covenant with you and with God, a relationship that is unconditional and without limits. And the rainbow is the most powerful reminder of that promise. Now, when we read the story of Noah's Ark or the Great Flood, we are firmly in the realm of mythology, and that's great. Many cultures in ancient times, the Chinese, Mesopotamians, Greeks, Hindus, Polynesians, Aborigines in Australia, Persians, Babylonians, they all had myths of a great flood. Now, some people think that's proof that an actual flood like the one described in Genesis really did happen. But our modern scientific understanding of geology and paleontology says otherwise. But myths are not intended to be historically accurate accounts. They're stories. They're stories that tell us something about ourselves, about who we are. So they might not be the literal truth, but they contain truths nonetheless. I often think of one of my favorite books, To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, is that a true story? No, it's fiction. But does it contain truths? You bet it does. The truth that the writers of Genesis were describing was God's covenant relationship with all people. Now, today, when we think of a covenant, I can often conjure up the idea of a legal contract. Now, where Ellen and I lived before moving here, our condo association had a covenant that said we could not do certain things, and it kind of cramped my style. No rummage sales, no Halloween decorations, no Christmas lights, no yard art, because I really wanted one of those giant wrought iron sculptures of a longhorn cow that moves in the breeze. But no, as classy as that would have been. So it was kind of a bummer because that covenant really restricted my creativity. The Green one's condo ought to look consistently boring from the outside. That's what we signed up for. Or we can think of a covenant in a more significant way, like marriage, for instance. Strictly speaking, marriage is a legal contract, but most people understand there's a lot more to it. It's a commitment to live in a relationship of mutual caring and sharing and loving support. But the covenant described in the rainbow story in Genesis is not a contract, and it's really not even a commitment between two parties to behave in ways that honor and respect and care for each other. The closest thing that approximates this Genesis covenant is a type of treaty that ancient Israelites would have been really familiar with. It's a covenant between a powerful nation, weak nation, and the weaker nation paying tribute in exchange for the protection of the stronger nation. But even then, the Rainbow Covenant following the flood wasn't quite like that either, because it was not between nations. It's a covenant between God and all of humanity. It's a promise. And the interesting thing is, it's a one-way promise. In this covenant story, God asks for absolutely nothing in return. And for a lot of us, that's sort of a hard thing to wrap our minds around, because in most relationships, there is some reciprocity going on. If we're receiving something, that means we're expected to give something back. A gift with no qualifications feels way too generous to believe. So what's the catch? But in this story that tells us about the very nature, the very essence of God, there is no catch. So let's think for a minute about the whole tale that's leading up to this rainbow. An infinitely powerful presence creates everything in a magical moment, but eventually he gets fed up with how people are misbehaving and just decides to wipe the slate clean and start over with one man named Noah and his family and just enough wildlife and domesticated animals to get things going again when the whole thing's over. And the thing that God does really is to return the earth to the way it is before creation, to watery chaos, to give creation a new chance, a second chance. God was a software engineer. This would be Earth, version 2.0. After the waters subside, after Noah and his family and all the animals leave the ark, God only gives Noah two rules to live by. Oddly enough, the first rule was to be sure to cook your meat thoroughly before you eat it, which was a good basic practice, and this was way before the invention of sushi, I think, so I don't think that counts. Honestly, it's kind of an odd thing to say after everything that's just happened, but there it is. There are some things in the Bible that just have to remain a mystery, I guess. But the second rule, though, was a lot more substantial, and that was don't kill other people. Because after all, God says, people are made in my image. So in other words, God is saying human beings are in me and I am in them, because that's what being in my image means. Other than that, be fruitful and multiply and enjoy life. The thing is, the covenant, the promise God was about to make, was not even contingent on following those two rules. God simply says, I promise you this, nothing like this flood will ever happen again. I am done starting over from scratch. When the rainbow's in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between me and you and every other living creature on the face of the earth. Now, we've heard this story so many times, it's kind of hard to take in the full scope of it, I think. On the surface, it seems to be just about promising to never again cause such a destructive flood. So I have to wonder, why not? If God is that powerful, then why not just hit the reset button every so often when everything goes south and people start misbehaving again? I think of times in human history when starting over with a new recipe might have seemed a reasonable idea. But God promised to never do that. What's changed? The only conclusion I think we can draw is God changed. Now, the storytellers never say why. They only make it clear that it is God's prerogative to do what God does. And in this story, what God does for the very first time is to give a one-way, everlasting, for all time promise. A covenant with everybody and with everything, no exceptions, no qualifications, no limits, no fine print. And the rainbow, all the colors of the spectrum of creation, representing everything and everybody, is God's own reminder and our reminder of that covenant relationship. The essential nature of God, the ancients are telling us, is to choose to make us and to make all of humanity a promise that never ends, has no conditions, and that includes everyone. Now, if the folks who took that myth of a great flood and made it their own, and who told it and retold it around campfires to their children and their children's children, and who would later write it down so that one day you and I would know it well, if they believed that story really describes the essential nature of God, I'm good with that. And Jesus took the very same story and made it his own. The true story that we are all created in the image of goodness, to do no harm to us, that we're created to enjoy this earth and this life, and that God's covenant is unconditional and extends to everyone on the spectrum of humankind. It's the same thing Gilbert Baker said about the rainbow flag, Jesus taught and showed was true about God's love. It fits all of us. It's all the colors. It represents all the genders. It represents all the races. It's the rainbow of humanity. And I think that is a flag worth flying. Amen.